Hi, it's Tilley, and welcome back to our next unit, Unit 2, the Marketing Research Process in Marketing Research MR2300. One of the fundamental concepts that we're going to look at in this course deals with how is it that we actually do marketing research? What is the process for it? So, in this video, we're going to define and describe the stages of the marketing research process. We're going to classify the basic types of marketing research, and we're going to describe the basic research designs. We're also going to take a look at a practical example of how we can apply this stuff. Generally, we can break marketing research into a 6-stage process. First, we need to define exactly what the problem is. What is it we're researching? What is the major issue? Part and parcel of that, we need to kind of get some background information on the problem so that we can address it. This is known as the exploratory research stage, where we try to get a better handle on the process before we actually move into the actual research. In stage 2, we actually design the research. How are we going to collect the necessary information that we require? What methodology, what order, how long is it going to take, what kind of budget do we need for it? These are all considerations in the second stage. As we move to the third stage, we actually go out and do the actual research, the sampling process, where we gather as much information as possible on which to make a decision. Now, it's important that that information be relevant, be timely, be efficiently gathered, and be effective in telling us what we need to know. Next, we move into actually gathering up all of the data together and then contemplating how can we take that data, which is raw material, and mold it in such a way that it yields effective information to us. So that the next stage then after that would be actually taking the data and interpreting it, understanding what it is we need to figure out from that information and whether we can use that information to help make a business decision, an informed business decision. Once we've done that, then we move into the actual presentation of the data. We need to communicate it effectively. We need to make it so that all of the stakeholders have a clear understanding of what we found and be able to use that information then on which to make a business decision. This 6-stage process is pretty straightforward. It is it's not easy. Certain stages take a lot longer than others, but it does yield useful results. First, the problem discovery and definition stage. Noted scientist Albert Einstein once quipped, "The formation of the problem is often more important than its solution." And it's so true. If we don't have a good situation analysis and a problem definition, it's very hard to get good information out of that. If we don't know the question we've asked, we're not going to get the answer for it. So it's very important to figure out the question first and spend a lot of energy at that. Before we figure out the question, in order to give us some background information, it's important that we determine some points. First of all, we've got to consider what are some of the symptoms of the problem we're looking at. And what we mean by a problem in a business sense is it could be an opportunity, it could be a business issue that we need to address. So we just use the term problem to kind of quickly define a business situation that we need to address. We also need to think about what is the situation that we find ourselves in. Let's analyze it. Let's go out and find as much information. We also think about, once we've done all that, how can we tightly package it into what exactly then, considering the symptoms, considering what we've looked at in terms of the environment, what exactly is the problem, and can we define it in 1 or 2 sentences? Something very simple that we can go and measure and get an answer to. That's very important. So with the problem, we clearly, once the problem is handled, once we know what the problem is, then we clearly lay out a process. We can clearly lay out a process and set specific objectives for what we need to do in order to address that problem. And essentially, that's what we do in this initial stage, is attempt through a number of techniques to go and define a problem that we can address. One of the key issues in helping to define a problem is using something we call exploratory research. Exploratory research is often done at the beginning of any process so that the researchers have a good understanding of the situation in which we find ourselves. Not necessarily addressing the problem directly, but getting background information. So if we can get as much background information as possible, it makes that problem that much easier to solve. Exploratory research allows us to do that. We can go out and get exploratory research by reading existing documents. This is known as secondary research. We can go speak to knowledgeable groups. We can go and look at focus groups. We can do a couple of little pilot studies, which are just little tests to see if things are the way that we say they are out there. So essentially, it is a very initial stage so that we can get our head around it. The second major stage, once we get our problem addressed and we figure out exactly what we're asking, then we need to actually design the research. Designing the research involves a lot of thought before we move into action. So when we think about research design, one of the primary things that we're looking at is, let's create a hypothesis. Let's make a bold statement that we're going to check with our research. For example, I will make a bold statement that most of the cars on the road today are white. That's my hypothesis. In my market and research, I'm going to prove through research methodology that that statement is true or that statement is untrue. So the hypothesis is an important start for most research. Let's get a hypothesis. What do you think that is happening? And then do the research to answer that question. Is it true or is it not true? With the hypothesis in hand, then we actually design the research using various research methods. And effectively, if you think, most research falls into three basic categories of research. The first thing deals with going out and surveying people. What I mean by most research is primary research, research that is collected specifically for this particular instance. The survey is an interesting tool because what the survey allows you to do is to go out to a population, and without speaking to every single person in the population, which is very time consuming and very costly, we pick a subset of the population, a representative sample, so it is. So instead, if there are 1,000 people in the population, we're going to interview 100 of them. And the theory of statistics say that if we do that selection correctly, that 100 will give us a good representation for what the 1,000 people would say. So the sampling process involves going out and using some methodology in order to select the people that you want to look at and interview and questionnaire, so that you can make a larger assumption about the population in general. Sampling usually involves going out and issuing these people a survey or asking them some questions or these sorts of things. So it's important when you do a sample that your sample is large enough so that you can eliminate problems that result when people say, no, I don't want to do that survey or don't have time or things like that. So we need to make sure we get a large enough sample in order to collect useful information. We also think about sampling from the point of view of the ease, the cost, the time involved, whether we should use technology to do the sampling, whether we should do it manually. These are all questions that are asked and considered in the sampling stage. Once we collect our sample, we have, if you imagine a survey and you collect 100 surveys, you have a stack of 100 sheets of paper on your desk. Then you need to move into the next stage, which is analyzing. We need to be able to take the data that comes out of those surveys and crunch it in such a way that it yields us useful information. So the data analysis is the next stage of any survey method, of any research methodology. So once we've gone and pulled the data, we need to be able to crunch it. That usually today involves computers and computer applications. It can be quite time consuming. The thing is, though, if we use technology to collect the survey data, that same technology is often useful in analyzing the data. So normally now we end up with computer managed surveys, which will allow for a much more quick and efficient and accurate method of collecting and analyzing data. As opposed to surveying and sampling people, another methodology that's often used in terms of collecting data is the experiment. The experiment involves creating a hypothesis we believe something will happen, and in a controlled environment, we test it. If you've ever watched the Mythbusters are constantly doing experiments. They make a proposition, so people can fly using homemade rockets. Okay, that's the proposition. Then they create a homemade rocket, hook it to a dummy, and test whether or not people can fly using rockets. So these are some of the types of things that happens with an experiment. It's a controlled environment in which we test a hypothesis. The third method, and probably a method that is fairly common, is something called observation. An observation simply allows the world to unfold as it should, and people watch what happens. Now, there's two basic types of observation. That is, people know they're being observed, or people don't know they're being observed. The don't know you're being observed creates some ethical challenges. We need to be aware of that. But sometimes, if people know they're being observed, then they may not act normally. So it is a bit of a toss-up whenever we do observation to say, should we have hidden observation, meaning people don't know we're watching us, and that comes with ethical challenges, or should we have known observation, and because of that, do people act the same as they would normally act? But in some cases, observation is quite useful, and if we do observation in a scientific way, it will yield good results so that we can make and test our assumptions or test our basic hypothesis. So finally, you've collected all your data, you've analyzed your data, and from that you need to be able to look at it and draw some conclusions. The first and foremost conclusion is you need to go back to your hypothesis and say, does this support or refute the hypothesis? Normally, a lot of information is gathered whenever you do survey research, so it's very important that you create a document. And the document normally follows a standard format that is outlined, and we'll talk about it in this course. That standard format would give the reader a clear understanding of what the problem was, how the data was collected, any limitations in collecting the data, the conclusions that were reached from the analysis, and recommendations on the analysis. Once a whole cycle is complete, then survey research and marketing research often begets further research. So the circle really continues round and around and around. As you can see in the graphic, that would indicate that this is an ongoing process, and it's very true. Market researchers are continuously collecting, analyzing, and reporting data. And with the fact that our society changes, it's understandable that the results will change from time to time. But regardless of change or not, the companies and organizations that collect the data can make more useful decisions and create better decisions that make more money or create a better environment for people because of it. So that's that. You should be aware of the marketing research process. Your major report looks at you actually doing this. And next, I'll give you an example of how we can actually do this process.